So when we talk about the question of gender and religiosity, it ultimately poses two different problems. One, how to increase men's religiosity, um, which has been decreasing steadily over many years, and how to decrease women's religiosity. We'll see two different strategies um, on how to do this. One centered around a woman's Christianity or a woman's uh, gynecology, um, and then adding a virility to Christianity in an effort to bring men back to the table. So when we talk about the problems with men leaving the church, one of the big problems with uh, men and the church has to do with the contradiction between masculinity, which says that man does not need to rely on anyone for anything, and then the idea that we're vulnerable and we need God in our life to solve our problems. So there's an inherent contradiction between those two concepts that ultimately lead men away from the church and towards a reliance on their own masculinity to solve their problems. One of the uh, first places that we see this um, adding a virile nature to Christ is with Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a former Major League Baseball player, and he left Major League Baseball to go around the country doing these tent revivals. And they were designed at bringing men back into the church. And they did this by making Christ a much more masculine figure. A Christ that would actually punch somebody in the nose for doing something wrong. It just doesn't seem like the Christ that I was raised with, but nevertheless, in order to reclaim this lost male generation that's relying more on their own masculinity to solve their problems, we saw some movements trying to make Christ more masculine. That those movements recreate images of Jesus as muscular, as dominant, as a fighter, as I talked about earlier. And then we have the Promise Keepers. And the Promise Keepers are kind of the most recent return to male's masculinity and female femininity. So when we talk about the Promise Keepers, I think it's instructional to read a short passage from the book that I found striking. So this comes from the 7 Promises of a Promise Keeper, and it suggests that men deal with women this way. Now remember, what the Promise Keepers are trying to do is return the male's masculinity back to the male, and then attract them back to the church by essentially reestablishing the feminine of the woman and the woman's place subjugated to the male. So they suggest that you sit down with your wife and say, honey, I've made a terrible mistake. I've given you my role in leading this family, and I forced you to take my place. Now I must reclaim that role. I'm not suggesting that you ask for your role back. I'm urging you to take it back. There can be no compromise here. If you're going to lead, you must lead. So the Promise Keepers are essentially encouraging men to reclaim their role of authority within the family and ultimately put women back in their place. And in all of this, a revitalized Jesus is necessary to reestablish the divinely ordained hierarchy of men over women. This is a response to males who feel threatened by women's equality, because over this period, women have gained more equality, and therefore they've gained more power. They've gained the opportunity to control their own finances, which in turn gives them power within their relationships. And this is an attempt for men to try and reestablish their control over women and over the marriage as well. So that's kind of how the men are trying to, or the church is trying to draw men back into the churches themselves. But parallel to this movement has been the feminist-inspired opposition. This, of course, is in the writings of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's. She talks about female subjugation as a great tragedy of our species. Makes reference to things like his religion, preoccupied with death, concerned with war and competition, and her religion, which is birth-based, life-affirming. And many of these feminist theorists are, of course, trying to retrieve the female teachings and texts that have been lost over males' control of religion for thousands of years. She encourages us to consider the lived experiences of women. She makes reference to ecofeminism and, of course, Wicca. And she really turns religion on its head, at least the monotheistic religions that have focused us on the afterlife and not the life that we live here. She says we need to focus on the life of the child while they're here. So a life-centered religion versus a death-centered religion that essentially says we're just here to get to the afterlife. So this new feminization, this new feminist movement within religion is much more like the pagan religions that painted Gaia as the Mother Earth, the goddess Earth. And we are on Earth. We are in touch with Earth. We are in touch with Gaia. Gaia lives within us, and we live within Gaia. So it's not surprising to see these ideas surfacing back in Wicca. Wicca is a long-standing derivative of pagan religious practices that have been around since before these primarily monotheistic religions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And this leads us to one of the greatest ironies, that an institution that is among the central pillars of gender inequality, i.e. religion, and men's domination, is one that women follow and believe in more than men. Perhaps it's so naturalized and taken for granted that men don't feel they need to participate in it to maintain dominance. Perhaps men don't participate because they don't have to. Either way, religion will always be political. Gender inequality, after all, is the women of men, not of God. So, ironically, ladies, you are the biggest participants in one of the most sexist social institutions in our society. We see it time after time. There's more women participating in religious ceremonies and religion in and of itself, belonging to the church, volunteering to the church, than there are men. Always has been. And maybe that's good. Maybe the churches are realizing that the people that are in their pews are mostly women, and maybe that is what's inspiring the church to continue to transform itself and become more gender sensitive, if not gender neutral, be more accepting to lesbians, gays, bisexuals, queers, transsexuals, those of difference. Or at least we can only hope so. These are some key terms to think about in reference to this chapter. Yeah, there you have it. Talk to you soon.